So I really wanted to talk about how far along we've gotten in the context of making more consistent the evaluation of adverse outcome pathways. And very briefly, I wanted to provide a little bit of information on background, the evolution and objectives of weight of evidence or confidence analysis for adverse outcome pathways, and kind of respond to the question, why would we bother? Because as we've heard, adverse outcome pathways in their own right can require a significant amount of effort just to develop them. And I'm going to address particularly the OECD Handbook supplement to the AOP guidance, where we're addressing particularly the key event relationships, as Steve mentioned, and the overall adverse outcome pathway. Very briefly provide an example, and then talk a little bit about principles of best practice. So the background in terms of weight of evidence analysis for adverse outcome pathways, they do draw on previous experience in documenting weight of evidence and degree of confidence for mode of action analysis for regulatory application. Now, the variation with mode of action analysis from adverse outcome pathways is that mode of action generally includes chemical-specific aspects such as toxicokinetics and metabolism, and where adverse outcome pathways are really the biological pathway. And it was really drawing upon that experience to develop the principles, definitions, and degrees of confidence relevant in the context of adverse outcome pathways. And it's based on modified Bradford-Hill considerations, which were initially introduced to assess causality of associations observed in epidemiological studies in humans, but they have been used more broadly. They've also been used in ecoepidemiology, and they've been used in a number of contexts with toxicological data. This is a work in progress, and the guidance is expected to evolve as additional AOPs are developed and documented. It's a bit like case law, that the more that you develop, the more you understand and can contribute to increasing our confidence in how we're documenting weight of evidence. So why Bradford-Hill considerations? They're very long-standing. Their utility is broadly recognized by a range of communities. There's considerable regulatory experience in their application, and they are sufficiently generic that with modification they're broadly applicable. They do lend themselves very well to mode of action adverse outcome pathway analysis. So the objectives of the weight of evidence guidance in the OECD supplement and wiki were really to simplify, clarify, and codify to the extent possible weight of evidence applications in an AOP context, addressing focus, in other words, to address a limited number of critical elements, to ensure the consistency and simplicity of terminology, to clarify the nature of the data that informs through inclusion of defining questions and provision of examples and criteria to bound categories of confidence of low, medium, and high. And to consider the relative weighting of the limited number of components, and then to integrate the quantitative aspects. So why bother? Again, we understand that compiling information to develop adverse outcome pathways is fairly labor-intensive in its own right. And it's really to provide a simple and consistent representation of the degree of confidence in various aspects of AOPs as a basis to facilitate their consideration for specific regulatory application. It won't be helpful if we're not communicating between the research and regulatory communities. That's really critical. It's also to identify key data gaps relevant to application and to have those data gaps taken into account in the development of the adverse outcome pathway. It's often not well understood by the research community the types of information that would be helpful in terms of speaking to the regulatory community from the perspective of degree of confidence or weight of evidence. But we have just started down the path, so it will require additional application and feedback and is expected to evolve over time. And we have a kind of forward agenda of things that we think need to evolve as well. So this is the refined adverse outcome pathway template in the handbook supplement. There's two, in fact, it has a fair bit of context related to weight of evidence, and it's addressed particularly within Section 6, which is on the key event relationship descriptions, and Section 7, which Steve also mentioned, the assessment of the adverse outcome pathway in total. So speaking to this kind of what we're looking at in terms of the key event relationships, in relation to qualitative weight of evidence, we're looking at biological plausibility and empirical support and quantitative understanding. That information that we collect or that we assess in that context then later feeds how we look at the entire adverse outcome pathway. So the biological plausibility and empirical support feeds the level of confidence in the KERs for the AOP, and the quantitative understanding, of course, feeds the same consideration in the adverse outcome pathway. So what is this, then, the focus and this consistent terminology for the qualitative and quantitative elements? So for qualitative weight of evidence and confidence, it's biological plausibility of the key event relationships. That's essentially the biology of the pathway. And in some cases, there's a great deal known. For example, if you think about mutagenic modes of action, essentially it is dogma, that hypothesized pathway. For essentiality of key events within the AOP, that relates to experimental support from specialized studies to block or modify key events or stop recovery studies. And I'm not sure that was well understood in terms of often empirical support was being taken to represent the kind of nature of support for essentiality. And in fact, of course, you can generate experimental data that gives you much greater evidence. And then empirical support for the key event relationships really address dose response, temporal, and incidence concordance. And we're really looking for a kind of a simple template to illustrate that, and not long text descriptions as we've commonly seen. And then, of course, the degree of quantitative understanding of the key event relationships, which we've already heard a lot about this evening. The other point about this is that these elements are weighted differently, with those at the top being weighted most and those at the bottom being weighted least. And in some of the early descriptions of adverse outcome pathways, there was a great deal of emphasis on the empirical support, and without so much emphasis on some of the other aspects that are also important. So in terms of the qualitative and quantitative assessing the relative level of confidence in the AOP, there's two annexes that are fairly important in the guidance. Annex 1, which guides consideration of the weight of evidence of the degree of confidence in the three elements, and it facilitates assignment of categories of high, moderate, or low against the specific considerations for each of the defined elements. And again, it draws on our current experience. And Annex 2 is the guidance for characterizing the level of quantitative understanding of KERs. So the objective is really to provide a basis for transparent rationale for consistent assignment of the degree of confidence and the extent of quantitation. And that requires explicit delineation of the limitations and data gaps. So this is a kind of a very simplified version of the table that appears in Annex 1. Again, I won't go through this in any detail in the amount of time I have. It's really just to draw your attention to a couple of probably largely misunderstood concepts, that essentiality of the key events. Again, you can generate experimental data to provide direct support by blocking some of the key events in the pathway. That the empirical support, that we're really looking for patterns of results there, and tabulating the information helps. For example, this is a template that was commonly used in mode of action analysis, where you've lined up the the incidence and temporal concordance. Essentially what we're illustrating here is we're looking at benchmark doses for different key events, and we're expecting to see this kind of pattern, that in fact they will increase through the key events, and of course they will also increase over time. So in terms of characterizing the level of quantitative understanding of the KERs, we're really looking at the extent of confidence we have in the ability to be able to predict a change in the key event down from a relevant measure of the key event up, and where we have a pretty good idea of uncertainty. We've accounted for modulating factors, and the the KER is generalizable in terms of the applicability domain, with the other considerations for moderate and weak being really variations in terms of the uncertainty, the modulating factors, and the applicability domain. The overall objective here is really to come up with some really illustrative, figurative representation of our degree of relative confidence in the extent of documentation of an adverse outcome pathway. Again, it's not to imply that we can't use quite perhaps adverse outcome pathways that don't have a great deal of weight of evidence for particular application, but to have an understanding of where they fit. And so, for example, you could imagine, for example, looking at the essentiality of the key events. You could consider that to be represented by the size of the nodes here, for example. You could take the degree of confidence in the biological plausibility and empirical support for the key event relationships. You just designated by high, moderate, or low, and then the degree of quantitation of the key event relationships, perhaps as the size of the arrows. And again, it's really just to get and this is still a work in progress, but it's really the objective here is just to get a feel for what's the degree of relative support for the different components. Very briefly, that we've started looking at one of the documented adverse outcome pathways. This is work that was done by Carol Yock and colleagues, and relating to the where the molecular initiating event is the alkylation of DNA, and then leading to insufficient or incorrect DNA repair, leading to mutations in male premeiotic germ cells and inherited mutations. And started looking at the information in the context of how we would lay it out to look at the patterns for empirical support. And again, there wasn't a good understanding previously that we weren't really looking for dose-response relationships of the key events, i.e., is there a dose-response relationship, but rather the concordance of those relationships between each of the key events. So essentially what the data here illustrate is that, of course, that you have much higher levels of adducts than you have of the mutations in the germ cells and the offspring. So, and another way of illustrating that is actually here you can see that, of course, the incidence of the alkyl adducts is much higher. And that's exactly the pattern we expect to see. So just a bit of a summary in terms of our best practice for weight of evidence and confidence analysis is really distinguishing the various elements and their relative contribution. And I think that they really needed clear delineation, appropriately characterizing the nature of support for the elements based on very clear defining questions, and the use of templates to summarize the data to simplify presentation and maximally inform this objective, particularly for empirical support. Identifying inconsistencies and uncertainties in the supporting data. Again, the templates for empirical support help with that. Making consistent calls on the degrees of confidence for the various elements with clearly delineated rationales based on the specified considerations. We do need a simple illustrative output of confidence and degree of quantitation for the key events and the key event relationships in the AOP. And identification, and really early identification of important data gaps that warrant attention in relation to increasing confidence for inference or extrapolation in a regulatory setting. So again, that's the reason to go through this process fairly early in the development of the adverse outcome pathway. And I'll leave it at that, and thank you for your attention. So.